Whereas cults tended to devalue Christ, the order embraced the truly biblical faith that accepted the true deity and humanity of Jesus Christ united in one person. This claim, though not patently false, did appear less than candid given the long-standing order teaching that Jesus was a great master who had taken on the Christ consciousness for a time after his baptism. In the Apology's conclusion, Rossi defended the right of Christian orthodoxy to preserve its deposit of faith. However, he asserted there were many valid ways of expressing this deposit. The trouble with many of those who claimed to represent Christian orthodoxy was the narrowness of their conceptions and the limitedness of their vision. Too often those who defended orthodox truth were merely defending that form of expression which they were most congenial against some other form with which they were more unfamiliar. There was no justification, the director declared, for an intolerant rejection of other forms of the same truth. Continuing in this vein, Rossi contended that the order's main virtues were its ecumenical openness and its attempts to transcend the scandal of Christian divisiveness. Although the Brotherhood's doctrines were intrinsically orthodox, its avowed position was to maintain unity in essentials, variety in non-essentials, and charity in all things. In the final analysis, the movement's main purpose was not to define doctrine or interpret the scriptures, but rather to practice Christian charity and to give the Christian life in community. In summing up, Rossi reiterated Earl Blyton's conviction that mystical experience was central to the practice of the Christian faith. Indeed, it was the established Church's inattention to the Western mystical tradition that had brought about its current lack of vitality. Until Western Christians acknowledged their abandonment of the integral spirituality of the Christian tradition, many believers would continue to turn to cults and Eastern traditions to satisfy their spiritual hunger. As concerned the order's alleged cultic identity, Rossi offered the advice of the Rabbi Gamaliel, who under similar circumstances had stated, "Refrain from these men, and let them alone, for if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught, but if it be of God, ye cannot overthrow it, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God." A 1979 promotional brochure had prefigured the main assertions of Rossi's Epiphany article, although it had done so with a good deal less polemical stridency. This brochure affirmed the Brotherhood's restorationist and ecumenical mission, while at the same time recasting its early history in mainstream Christian language. It became the standard information sheet sent out to the press and to prospective recruits, and could be obtained in the movement's restaurants, aid stations, and community centers. The brochure opened with the statement, "The Holy Order of Mans began as an ecumenical Christian community dedicated to a life of spiritual renewal in a secular age." The introductory statement downplayed the millennial and initiatory dimensions of the early order and highlighted those dimensions that were more acceptable to mainstream Christianity, namely ecumenism and charismatic renewal. The brochure then addressed the Brotherhood's overall mission and goals. The order sought to restore an awareness of the mystical dimension in human experience by returning to the simplicity of belief and practice of the first Christian communities. In addition, the Brotherhood sought to embody an authentic spiritual community that fostered unity and harmony with all people and all nature, and re-established the highest spiritual values in the family itself. The ecumenical reconciliation envisioned by the movement extended beyond Christians who were separated by denominational antagonisms to embrace all men and all faiths. No religion should be excluded out of hand, the brochure maintained, since they were all an expression of the one spirit in human life. Notwithstanding these ecumenical sensitivities, the brochure made clear its order's Christian pedigree. The movement was Christian in its essence, in its form, and in its practice. Moreover, the Brotherhood's monastic rule was compatible with the ancient and honorable Christian monastic tradition. Although the group existed as an independent community outside the authority of the major denominations, it recognized and submitted itself to the authority of the body of Christ on earth, the living Church. The order promulgated no new forms of Christianity, the booklet avowed, and accepted the basic doctrines of Christianity as expressed in the Apostles' Creed. In its final section, the brochure proclaimed the Brotherhood's striving to integrate the best features of contemplative Christian spirituality with an ethic of spontaneous charity toward all humanity. In this regard, the movement's emergency shelters, hostels, restaurants, and youth programs demonstrated each member's commitment to realize Christ as a living experience in their daily lives through service. Rossi used statements from the brochure in his attempts to refurbish the order's characterization based on earlier printed materials in national religious encyclopedias. In 1979, for example, the Director General wrote to Garland Publishing to protest the Brotherhood's unwarranted categorization as an occult order in Gordon Melton's Directory of Religious Bodies in the United States. Quoting from the brochure, Rossi declared the order to be Christian in its essence, form, and practice. He then denied that the Brotherhood possessed a unique form of Christianity. There is only one way to be a Christian, the director asserted, that is to accept Jesus Christ as one's Lord and to follow him in discipleship. Rossi concluded by asking Melton to correct the allegedly erroneous categorization of the movement in future editions of the directory. Unfortunately for Rossi, Melton had interviewed Earl Blyton in the early 1970s. After the interview, Blyton had given the researcher a complete edition of the group's esoteric teachings. When he questioned the new director about these non-traditional materials, Melton found him to be less than cooperative. Obscured by Rossi's convincing translation of Order Argot into mainstream Christian discourse were several precedents that would have important consequences for the group in the ensuing 6 years. Since movement insiders knew that the main purpose of these pronouncements was to promote an acceptable public image for the Brotherhood, they began to grow accustomed to the idea that Rossi's public communications were of less consequence from the group's self-understanding than his intra-order communications. On several occasions, the director himself reinforced this impression, asserting that although the order's interior striving would remain inviolable, the group must communicate its teachings to the world in terms it could understand. As if to confirm these assertions, the HOOM, which reminded readers that it was intended solely for members of the order, continued to print transcripts of Earl Blyton's sermons and classes, and special articles on such esoteric subjects as mysticism and sexuality, and the use of visualization in spiritual healing. In establishing the precedent of official doublespeak, however, Rossi, whether intentionally or not, lulled the group's members into an uncritical acceptance of his progressively mainstream Christian representation of the movement in public forums. These members, who remained committed to Blyton's Western esoteric orientation, could always dismiss their discomfort with these representations by reassuring themselves that the movement's seeming normalization was merely window dressing, made necessary by the changing religious milieu of 1980s America. The director's public statements during this period established another important precedent, that of presenting whatever image of the Brotherhood was deemed expedient to gain a sympathetic hearing from non-order audiences. In future interviews, forums, and discussions, the movement spokespersons would unabashedly represent the order as a normative Christian community and adopt the discourses of evangelicals, ecumenists, and both pre- and post-Vatican II Catholics as the occasion warranted. The most important consequence of this public relations strategy, however, was to begin a subtle dissolution of the movement's identity as a New Age initiatory order. As members became more practiced at portraying the Brotherhood in normative Christian terms, and seeing their community reflected back to them by the public in these terms, they themselves began to view the movement through these conceptual categories. In addition, as members familiarized themselves with the sophisticated Christological, ecclesiological, eschatological, and soteriological discourses of mainstream Christianity, they began to feel estranged from the Rosicrucian-style discourse of their past, and thus from the image of the order that was composed of this discourse's key elements. Throughout the early 1980s, the movement would suffer a mounting identity crisis as its members struggled to hold simultaneously these exoteric and esoteric visions of their brotherhood. This crisis would only intensify once the group's leaders began to confront honestly the fundamental contradiction between the worldview of Western esotericism and that of traditional Christianity. When this confusion of representations became both psychologically and institutionally untenable, a decision had to be made. The majority of members would, with Andrew Rossi and John McCaffrey, become convinced that the traditional view was the true one. The new Director General also moved swiftly to address the growing fragmentation of the movement that had resulted from changing member demographics and the proliferation of independent missions. In late February 1979, he called an esoteric council meeting and announced to the assembled priests that the Holy Spirit had revealed to him a new mission for the order. That mission was to establish a Christian community in every major city in the world. These communities would be dedicated to Mary, whose planetary work, Rossi maintained, was to sanctify Christian families, marriages, and children. The world's greatest need, according to the revelation, was for true Christian community, and the order's labor should now address this need directly. Rossi also stressed the unity of the Renunciate Brotherhood, the Order of the Disciples, and the Christian communities. Each respectively embodied one of the three principles of conscious Christianity: discipleship, initiation, and community. The Renunciate Order would become the embodiment of the interior spiritual realization that sustained and supported the exterior expression of God's glory through the lay communities. Rossi also reassured the Council of the Brotherhood's continued divine guidance. The order had not been abandoned by the host or by the Holy Spirit. Indeed, the Holy Spirit was using many different avenues to reach the consciousness of the order. These avenues included persons, books, and specific incidents. The movement must not faint at the task before it, for all would be given to accomplish its holy purpose. The Esoteric Council elaborated upon Rossi's announcement in an October 1979 HOOM letter. To accomplish the Brotherhood's new mission, the letter began, regional centers would have to become living examples of Christ's community on earth. These exemplary communities would be the vehicle through which the face of Christ would be seen in the world. The Brotherhood would also have to display a more unified obedience to the spiritual transmission coming through the Director General's office and the Esoteric Council. To facilitate such obedience, individual members would, in the future, be required to assemble in regional centers to hear and discuss all Council directives. This new mode of communication would assure a greater unity of support for the Director General's initiatives. Rossi's 1979 revelation initiated a radical change of focus and form for what had once been an expanding movement of young single adults distributed in small missionary teams throughout the world. Between 1978 and 1982, the order shrank in terms of institutional presence from 67 brother houses and mission stations to 33. Both the Discipleship Movement and the Christian Community Bureau moved their headquarters back to San Francisco in 1979. Almost every small mission station was closed and its personnel brought back to a regional center. Families and single members on independent missions also returned to these larger centers. To accommodate this consolidation of membership, the movement bought and refurbished large apartment buildings near the regional brother houses. By 1982, most members were concentrated in large communities in Boston, Atlanta, St. Louis, Indianapolis, San Francisco, Forestville, and Portland. By consolidating the Brotherhood's membership and resources, Rossi hoped to accomplish several objectives. The first of these was to retard the loss of collective zeal that had begun to occur with the increase of marriages and children between 1976 and 1978. As one priest recounted, the consolidation was an attempt to preserve the verve and the fire of the life and motion that had been the hallmark of the order's pre-family existence. The director also believed that large communities could better serve the needs of young order couples, many of whom were unsure of the group's ability to provide long-range assistance for them and their children. It was the attempt to build a communal life that was family-oriented, because this was the handwriting on the wall, the priest added. Finally, this consolidation allowed Rossi to re-establish administrative and religious control over the group's membership, most of whom were now required to live in regional centers headed by his chosen lieutenants. In the words of one ex-member, it was an attempt to take power over the problem, seize back control. Everything was too decentralized, it was fragmenting. This reassertion of central authority would be a necessary first step in the creation of a more unified system of beliefs and practices, and a more carefully nuanced public persona. Other forces contributed to the movement's general consolidation during this period. As an ex-member who lived in Boston recalled, another factor was that you had centers of prestige and power like Boston and Portland. To maintain those centers, when you were losing people, you had to bring more people in, and if you weren't gaining novices, then you had to bring people in from the field. A lot of it was economics, because you would absorb a center and its savings account and all of its chairs, etc. I was on the East Coast when all this was happening, and I was watching one mission station after another close down. Everything would be absorbed into that center, where it would go into the work that was oriented around the teacher who was there. For a time, the Boston Center, where the McCaffreys lived, tried to compete with the San Francisco-Forestville nexus, where the Rossis lived, for preeminence within the movement. This competition led to several questionable investments, the most egregious of which was the purchase of an overpriced beachfront property on Cape Cod. This property became a regional retreat center and private home for the McCaffreys. The Order's two royal families now lived in their camelots east and west, surrounded by cooks, gardeners, and nannies. The drive to create mother communities led the Brotherhood to limit its service outreach to high-profile projects in cities with a regional center. In St. Louis, for example, the IHSM Mary House stopped preparing its students for freelance missionary work and instead established a service development center. The center trained sisters to run large-scale service projects in the St. Louis community. These projects included a neighborhood drop-in center that provided emergency food and clothing, and Raphael House of St. Louis, a community-sponsored shelter for victims of domestic violence. A similar Raphael House became the focus of the Order's service work in Portland, Oregon during this period. At the end of 1979, a widely publicized service project was initiated when Right Reverend Vincent Rossi, as Master Andrew now referred to himself, sent out an urgent letter to all centers, communities, and disciples asking for an order-wide effort to bring relief to the people of Cambodia. The Holocaust, according to that country, Rossi warned, had already claimed nearly half the population and was now threatening the survivors with literal extinction because of starvation and disease. The movement's response, he concluded, would answer Christ's call to treat all humanity as neighbors and would demonstrate the global dimension of the Order's Christian discipleship. Rossi's plea galvanized a 6-month nationwide fundraising drive. Order members and community volunteers held auctions, fairs, bake sales, banquets, and choral performances in each of the movement's large centers. In addition, the group donated $10,000, defraying all operational costs, housed refugees at Raphael House in San Francisco, and sent a brother on a 2-year humanitarian mission to Thailand. The final amount raised came to over $190,000. Portions of this amount were distributed to Oxfam, World Vision, Catholic Relief Service, the Red Cross, United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, and the American Refugee Committee, all organizations that had pre-established aid networks in Thailand and Cambodia. Rossi refined this new vision of the Order in esoteric council meetings and HOOM articles during 1980. In these forums, the director re-emphasized the exemplary role the Brotherhood's communities would play for the whole of humanity. Through their collective commitment, they would become a living symbol of authentically Christian family values. The rearing of children, Rossi continued, had become integral to the mission of the Order, as children now constituted 1/5 of the community. Since society did not abide by the first principles of the spiritual life, it was vital that the Order create strong Christ-conscious communities, wherein it could raise its children to superconscious life. The Order could not allow its children to be raised and educated according to the standards of this world. This focus on community and family, the director asserted, was in complete harmony with the order's original identity as a monastic brotherhood called through revelation to prepare the earth for a new age. Unlike the monks of the Piscean age, however, the order community sought to sanctify all the patterns of human life, including marriage and child-rearing. To this end, the movement was creating a subculture wherein life's rites of passage could be experienced as phases or stages of the cosmic initiation of the soul. One of these rites, marriage, would become a holy priesthood through which the light of Christ and the knowledge of the mysteries would be brought to bear on society's most urgent problem, the bearing, raising, and educating of children. In this sense, order marriages would be a prophetic witness that stood solely for the truth of God and not for current norms. The success of the order, Rossi concluded, would be judged by the virtue and sanctity of its children and families. These refinements of the director's vision initiated a wide range of new activities over the next 4 years. The first of these was the development of preschools and primary schools in San Francisco, Forestville, Portland, Indianapolis, and Atlanta. These schools became the special province of Patricia, no longer called Masters Jesse and Rossi, who incorporated the educational philosophies of both Rudolf Steiner and Kate Douglas Wiggins into her summer training seminars. During these seminars, teachers learned how to model figures in beeswax, watercolor, finger knit, tell fairy tales, make dolls, and paint using a special Steiner technique. The schoolrooms themselves, which were designed to provide a dreamlike realm of childhood where the child's soul could unfold in God's own time, were filled with flowers and greenery, rocks and crystals, carpenter's benches with tools, and tiny gnomes hidden in old tree stumps. The rooms were divided into small play areas by soft folds of pastel-colored fabric draped from the ceilings to the floor. In each grade level, a different shade of paint covered the walls, with each color meant to facilitate the child's initiatory unfoldment. These steps represented the lesser initiations that each soul was believed to pass through naturally in childhood and adolescence. The higher initiations, on the other hand, which included baptism, illumination, and self-realization, were viewed as a conscious choice made by a fully mature adult. In a 1982 HOOM letter, Rossi was quick to defend the order's substantial outpouring of resources into these schools against complaints that the movement was putting its children on a pedestal. The schools, he maintained, far from being a peripheral phenomenon of concern only to parents, were central to the order's mission as defender and preserver of the initiatory path. This and every other activity of the order communities had one focus, the science of soul unfoldment. Seen in this way, the director continued, the schools were part of the order's practical application of the Tree of Life principles. If successful, this educational work would do more to affect the world than any other of the movement's activities. Rossi concluded by reassuring members that this order-wide effort would be confident of divine favor, just as the Brotherhood's service work was under the guidance of Raphael, the Archangel of Healing. So too were its schools under the guidance of Michael, the Great Protector and Defender of Souls. Another new dimension of the Brotherhood's community life was its rediscovery of seasonal festivals. These festivals were conceived using ideas from Rudolf Steiner as part of a yearly cycle of celebration that expressed the sacred mystery of humanity's earthly sojourn. According to this perspective, traditional peoples such as the ancient Hebrews had come together at festival times to celebrate the bond and relationship of all being and the wisdom of the Creator reflected in the creation. Present-day humanity, however, had sold out its sense of divinity to the easy philosophies of humanism, relativity, and individualism, and was no longer capable of such celebration. Contemporary festivals were pseudo-celebrations, a facade behind which existed the modern secular void, a sense of meaninglessness, purposelessness, and fear. By authentically celebrating the sacred festivals of antiquity, the Brotherhood hoped to return to the roots of its initiatory heritage and build a lasting foundation for its exemplary subculture. Between 1980 and 1984, order communities devoted a significant portion of their collective energies to the staging of these seasonal celebrations. The festal calendar was mainly oriented around the solstices and equinoxes, which resonated with the now seldom observed temple rituals of the early days, but also included such observances as May Day and Mardi Gras. The cycle began with Michaelmas, which was celebrated shortly after the fall equinox, with a traditional goose dinner and a harvest fair. At the harvest fair, members displayed their jams, sauces, baked goods, homemade wines, quilts, stained glass, handcrafted children's toys, paintings, photography, and other fruits of the year's labor. Throughout the day, folk and gospel groups performed, and puppet shows were staged. The grand finale of these events was a pie judging contest and an old-fashioned square dance. The fall festival was understood as a time when, through songs, stories, and games, children learned of the Archangel Michael and his never-ending battle against the Luciferic forces in creation. For adults, Michaelmas was believed to foster a closer attunement to the kingdom of angels. The winter solstice celebration began with traditional Advent gatherings on the 4-day evenings before Christmas. At these gatherings, the assembled family sang Christmas carols, lit Advent candles, and acted out segments of the Gospel Nativity story. In the week preceding Christmas, medieval-style mystery plays were performed in senior centers, neighborhood theaters, and Christian communities. These performances sometimes included professional actors and dancers from outside the movement. After a midnight worship service on December 24th, the festival continued with the observance of the 12 days of Christmas. During this period, families visited each other's homes, exchanged gifts, and prepared for the celebration of Epiphany on January 6th. This gala event appropriated traditions from various cultures and featured a candle-gathering ceremony, devotional songs, and the outfitting of rooms with symbolic representations of the Magi's gifts. The Spring Festival commenced with an Easter morning worship service, an Easter egg hunt, and a communal dinner which included homegrown musical entertainments. In May, a fair was held to celebrate the arrival of Mother Spring and the vanquishing of Father Winter. During the fair, members danced around a maypole, decorated a statue of the Virgin Mary with garlands of flowers, and crowned a May Queen from among the community's young adolescent girls. The summer solstice observance, which began as a family camping trip in some communities, developed into a celebration of St. John the Baptist's feast day on June 24th. As this saint was believed to be the patron of Christian discipleship, the summer festival became a time when lay disciples took their annual vows. In some communities, the solstice celebration culminated in an old-fashioned ice cream social at a local park. The day's events included folk dancing, layered cake contests, scavenger hunts, three-legged races, and musical performances by barbershop quartets and gospel groups. With the development of both the festivals and the children's schools during the early 1980s, the order seemed to have expanded beyond its late 1970s evangelical emphasis on discipleship and Bible study, and to have entered a much wider field of endeavor, the creation of a traditional Christian subculture. At seminars and meetings, the movement began to promote a vision of itself as an ark of safety in the turbulent waters of the post-Christian era. In this ark, all that was valuable in Western civilization, including its arts, crafts, myths, religious wisdom, theater, and seasonal festivals, would be reclaimed and incorporated into the group's community life. From this time onward, the Brotherhood would gradually refocus its identity within the parameters of a twofold mission: the recreation of a traditionalist Christian subculture and the complete rejection of the contemporary world. In this endeavor, the order would have much in common with Christian fundamentalists, whose rejection of American secular values was just coming to national attention during this period. To some extent, the order's new focus on community and family life between 1979 and 1984 did engender stronger group cohesion. Instead of moving from station to station as they had previously done, members now settled into permanent communities. This allowed the many young families in the movement to develop a dense and stable network of intragroup social relationships. The prospect of rearing their children in a safe, culturally innovative environment with like-minded friends had a strong enough appeal to draw back into the community many of the families on independent missions. Single missionaries, too, returned to the regional centers, many with the hope of finding a spouse in the larger pool of unmarrieds there. The mother communities began largely self-sufficient enclaves where members created and sustained an alternative worldview, economy, and subculture. To lessen the need for outside employment, the communities developed small businesses such as appliance painting, woodworking, and commercial graphics. In centers such as Portland, San Francisco, Boston, and Indianapolis, the Brotherhood built prosperous restaurants that were grossing over $2 million a year by 1982. In spite of this successful community building, however, the movement began to falter. Between 1978 and 1983, the Renunciant Order's adult membership dropped from 661 to 393, not counting 111 children. As married couples turned their focus toward child rearing and home life, the middle-class values of their early backgrounds began to reassert themselves. Many couples came to resent the invasion of their privacy by order leaders, the partial abrogation of their authority over their children, and the constant demands put upon them for participation in community projects. They also found that the ill feelings generated by constant communal haggling over family purchases could be effectively alleviated by becoming financially independent lay members. For many families, in short, the lifestyle of a semi-monastic community was simply incompatible with their personal needs. Well over 100 families became secularized during this period and joined the movement's Christian communities. To compound these defections, the recruitment of novices ground to a halt, dropping from an average of 21 per month in 1978 to only 3 in 1983. There were several likely causes for this, the most important of which was the drying up of the pool of counterculture recruits that had fed the movement during its first 10 years. As American society moved in an increasingly conservative direction during the late 1970s and early 1980s, young adults no longer pursued spiritual enlightenment or cultural innovation with the same degree of ardor as their older siblings had shown. These youth were content to affiliate with mainstream religious institutions, or no institution at all, and to pursue more conventional economic and professional objectives. The lifestyle offered by the order was simply too alternative to attract this more pragmatic generational cohort. Another likely cause for the decrease in recruitment was the more closed social network that resulted from the group's self-sufficient communalism. With fewer members working and circulating in the world outside the Brotherhood communities, the opportunities to develop meaningful contacts with non-members diminished greatly. In addition, the demographics of the movement had changed. Most members were now parents in their 30s and 40s. They were no longer the young idealistic missionaries of the Blyton era, with extensive social networks outside the order they could exploit for recruitment. A final, already alluded to cause was the widespread fear of NRMs fostered by the period's influential anti-cult movement. This fear created a cultural climate in which membership in small alternative religious communities, especially those that demanded a high level of commitment, carried a strong social stigma. The threat of this stigma appeared to be enough to dissuade most youths from joining NRMs after 1978. The order's increasingly virulent critiques of American society led to the movement to end its long-held prescription against political activity. One of these critiques appeared in Rossi's May 1982 letter to the Brotherhood, which addressed the responsibility of Christians concerning the unprecedented crisis of nuclear weapons. The director began his missive by acknowledging that the order had always avoided taking advocacy positions on public issues. Nevertheless, the issue of nuclear weapons, because it concerned the potential elimination of human life and the wholesale despoliation of the planetary biosphere, demanded an unequivocal response. Indeed, the issue transcended partisan politics and struck at the spiritual and moral core of human existence. Rossi next argued that man's law was legitimate only to the extent that it was exercised for the common good. When this law was used to threaten the common good, it lost its legitimacy. In his view, nuclear weapons represented just such an abuse of temporal authority. Quoting Thomas Merton, the director declared that no government had the right to defend itself by permanently destroying the billion-year heritage of the planetary biosphere. When faced with America's deterrent policy of mutually assured destruction, therefore, Christians must follow the teachings of Jesus and become peacemakers. Becoming a peacemaker, however, required more than simply telling the world it was going to hell and needed repentance. It entailed representing Christ in the councils and activities of secular peace organizations and creating a new climate of consciousness in which the nuclear problem could be seen as a compelling moral and spiritual crisis for humankind. In the letter's conclusion, Rossi's tone turned darkly apocalyptic. The world was shuddering on the brink of annihilation, the director warned, and the present generation would perhaps be the last to have a chance to avert global suicide. The logic of events and the balance of terror, he contended, were the arguments of the Prince of Darkness. Although the job of peacemaking seemed futile, Christ was calling across the barriers of language and race, and a mighty throng was forming that would proclaim, "I will not serve," to the satanic forces threatening humanity's destruction. Unless Christian disciples joined in this throng, the world would be wiped out by the mushroom fires of nuclear war. The Director General's letter was publicized throughout the movement and had the effect of mobilizing members to join large-scale peace demonstrations around the country. Lay disciples in Boston and Portland, for example, took part in local walks for peace during 1982, and over 60 members of the San Francisco community joined 6,000 others in a prayer circle around the Livermore Laboratory during June 1983. In addition, Epiphany magazine devoted its Christmas 1982 issue to peacemaking. The issue featured an interview with Daniel Ellsberg, articles on Christian nonviolence, and a book review of Jonathan Schell's The Fate of the Earth. These responses opened the door to further political activism by order members, including participation in civil disobedience movements like Operation Rescue. Rossi's dire warnings also fueled a brief period of apocalyptic fervor in the Brotherhood, during which both ancient and contemporary prophecies of a coming planetary conflagration were accorded great authority. Given the predicted likelihood of an imminent chastisement of the earth and the need for renunciate communities to be prepared economically for this event, married couples were strongly pressured to limit the size of their families to 2 children. The entire order leadership became personally caught up in this fervor, even to the point of promoting the undeniable authority of Roses from Heaven, a sensationalistic collection of purported Marian warnings published during the 1970s in Bayside, New York. The order also became a vocal advocate of ecological awareness. Although calls to recycle and to use biodegradable products had been common in the Brotherhood since the early 1970s, it was only after Rossi published his ecological manifesto, the 11th Commandment, toward an ethic of ecology in Sunflowers and Epiphany, that an organized movement took shape. The manifesto argued that the solution to humankind's environmental problems would not be founded in the technological dimension. Rather, a revolution in consciousness was needed through which humans could regain their awareness of the presence of God in the natural world. By recovering this aboriginal consciousness, humans would become so attuned to nature that they would be unable to open the earth or cut down a tree or kill an animal without a profound emotional response or heartfelt prayer. The piece also contended that for Western humanity, whose collective psyche had been shaped primarily by the Christian paradigm, Christianity was the authoritative foundation upon which an ethic of ecology should be based. Indeed, an unspoken commandment defining the proper relationship between humans and nature had always existed in this tradition. In view of the ever-worsening ecological crisis confronting humanity, Rossi had been moving moved to proclaim in the spirit of the Scriptures this 11th commandment. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Thou shalt not despoil the earth, nor destroy the life thereon. Obedience to this commandment had practical implications. The director asserted, which included studying the ecological crisis so that one could make informed decisions, reading the lives of great naturalists like John Moyer and Henry David Thoreau, and forming local associations to promote positive environmental action with a spiritual foundation. This call to environmental arms led to the establishment in 1981 of the 11th Commandment Fellowship, a San Francisco-based organization with chapters throughout the United States. The fellowship published a national newsletter and sponsored study groups and stewardship seminars in both the United States and Canada. It also encouraged ecological sensitivity in all facets of the Order's communal life, including the use of environmentally friendly products such as cloth diapers and the development of small-scale appropriate technologies such as solar panels and fish ponds. Most of the Brotherhood's large communities developed recycling programs for their homes and restaurants and supported neighborhood gardens and food cooperatives. The movement's critique of the post-Christian era reached a fever pitch in 1983 with its publication of Cult of the Metamachine, The Coming Computerized World. This special issue of Epiphany used excerpts from such anti-modern thinkers as Jacques Ellul, Fritjof Schoen, and E.M. Forster to paint a dizzying portrait of electronic high technology's catastrophic impact on contemporary society. The journal's editors, in their introduction to the issue, stated the unavoidable conclusion they had reached concerning the computer age. Behind its playful and beneficent facade was a soul-deadening technology that was swiftly infiltrating every dimension of human life. The computer, which had been sold to Western consumers as a passport to high-tech utopia, represented in reality a reckless descent into abstraction, a descent leading ultimately to the eradication of authentic human creativity and imagination. Under the cult of the metamachine, humanity had been reduced to largely banal and meaningless pursuits and had uncritically accepted a technological centralization that could usher in the most complete tyranny ever imagined. In the spirit of prophetic witness, the magazine was conveying a warning that the absolute God had been subjugated by electronic high technology and that humanity's soul lay in the balance. The inspiration for this magniloquent critique of the computer revolution came from two small books published in 1927 and 1945 by the French perennialist thinker René Guénon. The two works, The Crisis of the Modern World and The Reign of Quantity, set the principles of the primordial tradition, a theosophically inspired idea noted earlier in Chapter 2, against what Guénon believed were the chief philosophical underpinnings of modernity: humanism, individualism, materialism, scientism, and evolutionism. In Guénon's darkly pessimistic vision, modern civilization had completely lost touch with sacred tradition, which alone provided the means by which humans could attain spiritual transformation, and had entered the final throes of a cosmic dark age. As part of this devolution, the parameters of human reality had been reduced to experiences that could be measured, standardized, and quantified. Guénon saw this trend reflected in modern concepts of social organization, i.e. majority rule, social uniformity, and mass public education, in the increasing influence of statistical analysis and mass advertising, in the industrial practices of mass production, and in the purely quantitative analysis of number in mathematics. This domination of pure mindless quantity had resulted in the increasing digitization and concretization of reality and a mode of human experience devoid of depth or quality. The only means of escape from this reign of quantity, in Guénon's view, was for humanity to embrace the authentic esoteric teachings teachings still kept alive in India and in traditional forms of Christianity. Director Rossi had come across Guénon's writings in the late 1970s and been struck by the remarkable complementarity of their assertions with the Order's avowed mission to revive ancient apostolic Christianity. During the early 1980s, Rossi became more and more convinced of Guénon's thesis and began to work out its implications for the Brotherhood's future work. In 1982, he directed the editorial staff of Epiphany to contemplate Guénon's writings, as well as those of other leading perennialist thinkers such as Ananda K. Kumaraswamy and Frithjof Schuon. The staff soon recognized in the computer revolution a confirmation of Guénon's prophecies and decided to formulate a wide-ranging critique of contemporary information technologies. Traces of Guénon's thought could also be discerned in several articles and letters Rossi authored during this period. The first of these was sent to Christianity Today in response to a 1981 article by James Bjornstad criticizing the Order's occult cosmology. Both conservative and liberal Christianity, Rossi declared, had bowed to the rationalizing, demythologizing, and relativizing tendencies of modernity's reign of quantity by separating the spiritual creator from the material cosmos. This flattening and impoverishment of Christian cosmology had led to a loss of the sense of God's immanence and to the development of a cosmology indistinguishable from that of materialistic scientism. Rossi then defended Earl Blyton's deficiencies as a theologian by comparing this great teacher to the Apostle Paul, who came not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. The Order would not demonstrate its non-occultic nature by rejecting Blyton's teachings, as Bjornstad has suggested, for correctly understood, these teachings were linked throughout with the profoundest Christian thought of the classical tradition. Two other examples of Guénon's influence on Rossi appeared in the director's open letters to Coevolution Quarterly and Parabola. Rossi's criticism of Coevolution Quarterly had to do with the benign condescension and not-so-benign contempt with which the magazine's articles allegedly approached Orthodox Christianity, whereas he could understand why some New Age folk had turned away from the seeming emptiness of modern churchianity toward the genuine spirituality of lamas, roshis, and Sufis. Rossi could not countenance the curious habit of Western converts to other faiths of comparing the best in their adopted tradition with the remembered worst of their native tradition. This prejudicial attitude had blinded these converts to the fact that for every ordinary Christian believer there was an ordinary Hindu believer, and that for every realized sage of one tradition there was undoubtedly a God-intoxicated saint in the other. If the Coevolution Quarterly and its sister publication, the Next Whole Earth Catalog, were serious in their stated intention to provide access to spiritual tools, they would give as much attention to the works of traditional Christian spirituality as they did to the more trendy Eastern traditions. In Rossi's letter to Parabola, he took Joseph Campbell to task for his disappointingly crude remarks about traditional Christianity in a 1982 interview. During the interview, Campbell had accused the Christian tradition of being opaque to the transcendent and of concretizing its idea of God in the historical figure of Christ. The true sage, in Rossi's view, neither deplored the devotionalism of exoteric traditions, nor attempted to destroy the human and necessary image of God that these traditions used as part of their devotional exercises. A compassionate insight, he added, would have realized that the truly transcendent metaphysics of Christianity was to be found in the mysteries of the Incarnation and the Redemption, and therefore precisely in the person of the God-man Jesus Christ. Campbell's attempt to separate Jesus from Christ had tampered in an unconscionable way with the universal mythos expressed through traditional Christian doctrines. In retrospect, it can be said that Rossi's encounter with Guénon's writings signaled the turning point in his thinking about the order and its mission. The uncompromisingly elitist tenor of Guénon's worldview seemed to appeal to the part of Rossi's identity that, like his teacher Blyton, was wedded to the heroic image of the all-wise master Gnostic. Moreover, Guénon had come from a similar Roman Catholic background and been ordained a bishop during the early 1900s in a neo-Gnostic church with ties to European Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. The French esoterist, however, had turned in disgust from what he perceived to be the pseudo-spirituality of the occult establishment and joined a traditional Sufi order in Egypt. It was Rossi's awareness of this fact and of Guénon's virulent condemnation of modern occult orders, especially these groups' appropriation of powerful initiatory techniques from authentic esoteric traditions, that likely planted the first seeds of doubt in his mind concerning Blyton's early enterprise. From the early 1980s onward, Rossi seemed compelled to obey Guénon's dual imperatives to search out the few dwindling traces of orthodox spirituality that still existed in the world, and to depart from the anxiety, pseudo-religion, and superficial knowledge that characterized the present dark age. The Director General had been brought, in the words of Jacob Needleman, to a state of intellectual penitence, a moment of mental crisis and decision, by Guénon's penetrating analysis of the modern world. He was ripe for an encounter with a form of Christian orthodoxy that embodied the rigor and absolutizing of tradition demanded by Guénon's uncompromising perspective. Before this encounter occurred, however, the Director General made one final effort to salvage the essential dimensions of Blyton's universalist path. He privately requested an interview with Fritjof Schuon, the spiritual master of a Guénon-inspired school of perennialist initiates. Schuon, like Guénon, had embraced Sufism during his search for an authentic esoteric tradition, and had written the classic manifesto of the perennialist perspective, The Transcendent Unity of Religions. Rossi hoped to align the order in some way with Schuon's spiritual transmission. The reply the director received to his request for an audience was not at all what he had expected. The Sufi sheikh refused to meet with Rossi because he judged the order to be a self-made school of pseudo-initiation that was unconnected to any authentic religious tradition. Although Rossi would later see this rejection as an instance of divine providence, at the time it likely constituted a frightening confirmation of his deepest doubts about Blyton's non-traditional path. Shaken to the core of his identity, Rossi began a desperate search for an authentic tradition within which to ground his pseudo-initiatory brotherhood. The director could not have foreseen that his search would lead him to a destination far removed from the original teachings and practices of the Holy Order of Mans. Chapter 6. Safe Moorage in Orthodoxy. Christ the Savior Brotherhood as the Restored Catacomb Church. As Director Rossi explored the doctrines of apostolic Christianity, he read extensively in the works of the early patristic fathers. It was his exposure to the writings of Simeon the New Theologian, however, that provided him the decisive cognitive bridge between the order's initiatory way and the Eastern Orthodox tradition. This 10th century Byzantine monk spoke of a mystical experience during which the uncreated light of God, appearing as a solar disk in the heart, illumined the virtuous Christian believer. If the disciple blessed with this vision of light continued in a life of humble obedience to God's will, Simeon taught, the Holy Spirit would in time unite with his body and soul, making him a son of God, endowed with divine intelligence and incorruptibility. Simeon called this process theosis, divinization, and conceived it to be the ultimate destiny of Christian saints. The prototypical divinized human, according to the monk's writings, was the God-man Jesus Christ. Rossi quickly perceived the close parallels between Simeon's teaching and Blyton's initiatory path of illumination and self-realization. Simeon's teaching, however, had two advantages over Blyton's system, in the director's judgment. Because it occurred within the context of the time-tested tradition of monastic spirituality, Simeon's light mysticism was safeguarded from becoming, in René Guénon's terms, counter-traditional or pseudo-initiatic. This ancient tradition, with its emphasis on penitence, humility, and self-abnegation, helped disciples avoid spiritual pride, viewed as a widespread problem in the order, and live a balanced life of contemplation and service. The second advantage for Rossi was that the mystical teachings of Simeon could be transmitted reliably from generation to generation because they were rooted in the stability of a venerable ecclesiastical organization. Put another way, the tradition was not likely to disappear with the death of any one teacher. Hopeful that he had at least rediscovered an authentic mystical tradition that validated the order's initiatory practices, Rossi began an intensive study of Eastern Orthodox monasticism. As part of this effort, he read a collection of back issues of the Orthodox Word, an obscure journal devoted to traditional Russian monasticism. The director had come across this collection while visiting the editorial offices of Epiphany magazine during 1983. What Rossi found in these journals was a traditionalist perspective so uncompromising and so, it seemed to him, devastatingly insightful in its criticism of modernity that it completely convinced him of its spiritual authenticity. It would be fair to say that for Rossi, his reading of the Orthodox Word changed everything. The order's leader was particularly impressed with articles in the journal by Seraphim Rose, a Russian Orthodox monk whose essays roundly condemned what Rose saw as the enemies of true Orthodox Christianity in late 20th century America. Rose's main antagonist was Christian ecumenism, which he called the chief heresy of the 20th century. At its best, Rose asserted, ecumenism represented a sincere error on the part of Protestants and Catholics, who in seeking Christian unity had failed to recognize that the true Church of Christ already existed and that they were outside it. At its worst, however, the ecumenical movement, and especially the dialogue with non-Christian religions, was a diabolical deception that could potentially destroy Orthodox Christianity. The Orthodox bishops who followed this demonic intellectual fashion, Rose claimed, were betraying the Orthodox Church and falling under the sway of a Masonic ideology that had as its aim a syncretic world religion. The prophet of this new religion of the Antichrist, in Rose's view, was the early 20th century Russian philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev. Berdyaev was guilty of two crimes. He had rejected the monastic ascetic spirit of historical orthodoxy, and he had welcomed the early ecumenical movement as the harbinger of a new era for Christianity, one in which the authentic mystical traditions of the world would recognize their true spiritual kinship. The means through which the Antichrist was bringing the churches into union, Rose warned, was the charismatic revival. This dangerous movement was a kind of Christian mediumism that opened worshippers to demonic possession. Rose viewed the charismatic baptism of the Holy Spirit as a pagan initiation, more akin to spirit possession than to anything Christian. The other charismatic gifts, including speaking in tongues and prophesying, were dismissed as non-Christian phenomena similar to those ascribed to shamans and modern spirit mediums. All of these so-called gifts of the Spirit, the monk concluded, were counterfeit miracles helping to prepare the world for the false Messiah. Rose's articles also portrayed Hinduism as an enemy of Christianity that had been smuggled to America by the Vedanta movement. Through philosophical obfuscation, the monk maintained, this movement had attempted to establish that there was no significant difference between Christianity and Vedanta Hinduism. The most dangerous aspect of these efforts was the attempt to equate Orthodox contemplative prayer with Eastern spiritual practices. It was the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, Rose asserted, who had played the pivotal role in this attempt. Merton's treacherous mistake had been to assume that all mystical experience, whether Buddhist, Hindu, or Christian, was true. Merton should have known better, the monk reasoned, since the Scripture and the Church Fathers had expressly warned that some mystical experience was demonically inspired. In Rose's final judgment, Merton's writings, by introducing pagan spiritual practices into Christian monasticism, had attacked the vitals of Christianity. The order's director, in contemplating Rose's severe condemnation of religious syncretism and ecumenism, was forced to confront a sobering possibility that the Holy Order of Mans, through its eclectic appropriation of spiritual practices and its efforts to unite all faiths, was in the vanguard of the Antichrist's assault on the true Church. Whether he came to this conclusion is not known. However, the Director General's actions between 1983 and 1988 indicate that he was uncomfortable enough with even the possibility of such guilt that he was willing to take radical remedial action. During this period, Rossi would slowly discard every element of the order's identity that did not accord with Rose's stringent standards for orthodox correctness. In the process, he would change the Holy Order of Mans into Christ the Savior Brotherhood, the avowed mission of which would be to defend the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the pillar and ground of truth, in an age of apostasy. The first step in Rossi's long-term plan was to introduce members to the Nicene Creed and to portray it as the epitome of the Brotherhood's spiritual beliefs. In an April 1983 lecture, the director carefully distinguished between understanding the Creed as a dogma, which in accordance with the group's long-standing non-dogmatic stance he was against, and understanding it as an empowering declaration of faith. Within this latter context, he suggested that members study the history of the Church's creedal formulations. The Apostles' Creed in particular became a popular topic of research and discussion after this lecture and appeared on the rear cover of the July HOOM. In October, pastors of the movement's Christian communities were called to San Francisco for an unprecedented national conference. The aim of the conference was to introduce the pastors to the main elements of Christian orthodoxy, including the Apostles' Creed, so that they could begin to transmit a more serious and professional version of Christianity to their parishioners. To augment the pastors' efforts at Christian re-education, Rossi then organized seminars in local Christian communities. During these gatherings, members were encouraged to embrace the ancient apostolic doctrine as the foundation of their fellowship and prayer. This doctrine, which was summarized in the Apostles' Creed, would bring light and uprightness into the community's life. The seminars were conducted by a small group of priests whom Rossi had personally trained in Orthodox Christian traditions. The director also attempted to contact the St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood, which published the Orthodox Word. This monastic order had formed in San Francisco during the mid-1960s to promote the sainthood of Herman of Alaska, a 19th century Orthodox missionary to the Aleutian Islands. Over time, the Brotherhood's activities had expanded to include the printing of Orthodox hagiographic works, the translation of Russian monastic writings, and the publication of the Orthodox Word. The two men who had formed the Brotherhood, Gleb, later Herman Podmashensky, and Eugene, later Seraphim Rose, were members of the Russian Synodal Church, a small 100,000 members Orthodox jurisdiction known for its anti-Soviet, pro-Tsarist, and traditionalist orientations. Podmashensky was a native Latvian whose father had been imprisoned by the Soviet Army when it invaded the Baltic nation in 1940. At the age of 15, he escaped to America with his mother. The young émigré studied psychology at Boston University before deciding to enter the Russian Synodal Seminary in Jordanville, New York. Upon graduation in 1961, Podmashensky made a pilgrimage to the remote burial site of Herman of Alaska. While there in Alaska, the young monk dedicated himself to promoting the cause of Herman's sainthood and to continuing his missionary efforts in North America. Podmashensky then moved to San Francisco, where he worked with the controversial synodal bishop John Maximovich. Rose was a native Californian who had attended Methodist and Presbyterian universities in his youth. In his late teens, he developed an interest in Buddhist philosophy and began a study of ancient Chinese at the University of California at Berkeley. While there, Rose worked with the eminent Chinese linguist Peter Budberg, translating ancient Chinese poems and completing a master's thesis on the writings of Lao Tzu. During the course of a comparative religion seminar with Alan Watts, Rose came across the writings of René Guénon. He was so captivated by the French thinker's critique of modern religious trends that he wrote 3 lengthy essays for Watts, each of which championed Guénon's traditionalist perspective. In time, the young scholar tired of what he considered to be academia's widespread adherence to ephemeral intellectual fashions. He left Berkeley before finishing his doctorate and began attending services at the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in San Francisco. It was there, while auditing a class in the early 1960s, that he met Podmashensky. Rose soon converted to Orthodoxy and found employment in the St. Herman Brotherhood's missionary bookstore. In 1967, Podmashensky and Rose decided to organize a small monastic community after the model of the legendary Optina and Valam monasteries in northern Russia. To this end, they acquired a piece of land in the mountains of northern California, just south of the small town of Platina. The 2 monks moved to Platina in 1969 and maintained their monastic and publishing enterprise until 1982, when Rose, then 48, died of an intestinal ailment. The monastery began to fragment after this unexpected event, and its future was in question throughout 1983. Rossi, after making inquiries, arranged to meet the now designated abbot Podmashensky at a small Orthodox church in Eureka in late 1983. The 2 men took an immediate liking to one another, and Podmashensky invited Rossi to attend a retreat in Platina during January 1984. The Director General was impressed with the otherworldly atmosphere he experienced at the monastery and with the strict rule the monks followed. He was also intrigued by the myth of origins the abbot posited for the St. Herman Brotherhood. This myth maintained that the mystical traditions of catacomb Christianity had been kept alive within the Byzantine Church and transmitted through its missionaries to Holy Russia in the 10th century. Russian Orthodox monasticism had preserved these traditions and handed them down from spirit-bearing elders to their disciples in an unbroken line stretching back hundreds of years. Podmashensky claimed initiation into these ancient practices through an old priest whose training had occurred at Optina Monastery, one of the last repositories of catacomb spirituality in Tsarist Russia. Before leaving, Rossi arranged to meet with the abbot in San Francisco so that they could continue their discussions. During a luncheon in February at Raphael House, Rossi quietly confided to Podmashensky that he had experienced a conversion to Orthodoxy while reading the Orthodox Word. He also stated his conviction that the Russian monastic spirituality of the St. Herman Brotherhood was the path to which God had called him. However, his position as the Director General of an independent religious order had left him in a difficult predicament. According to Podmashensky, Rossi asked him, "Should I abandon everybody, my whole movement, and become Orthodox? Or should I wait until they are converted also?" The abbot, who had dedicated himself to continuing St. Herman's missionary work in America, perceived at once the opportunity that lay before him. He counseled Rossi to retain his position as the head of the order and to work patiently with him to prepare the Brotherhood for baptism into Orthodoxy. The 2 then took a tour of Raphael House, which ended in the first-floor chapel. Upon entering, Rossi walked to the altar, raised his hands, and proclaimed, "O God, you led Father Herman into our midst. Let us be one." The pact between Rossi and Podmashensky got off to an inauspicious start when, on February 22, 1984, the abbot was temporarily suspended from his priestly functions by an ecclesiastical court in his San Francisco archdiocese, following charges of moral impropriety. Indignant that his bishop had deemed such charges worthy of a hearing, the monk refused to appear before a court of inquiry. Instead, he shuttled between Platina and an affiliated monastic community in Spruce Island, Alaska, avoiding contact with church officials. In an attempt to find ecclesial sanction for his continued priestly functioning, Podmashensky petitioned Bishop Benedict, exarch of the Western Diocese of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Vassiloupolis, an autocephalous jurisdiction of traditionalist Greeks and Romanians headquartered in Queens, New York, to come under his protection. Benedict was a former Catholic monk who had converted to Orthodoxy and established the Christ of the Hills Monastery in Blanco, Texas. Negotiations concerning the petition would continue throughout 1984 and 1985. Undaunted by these developments, Rossi began to introduce Orthodox forms into every facet of the Brotherhood's liturgy, instruction, and spiritual practice. Without consulting the Esoteric Council, for example, the Director General ordered his regional directors to incorporate Orthodox prayers into the group's Lenten observance. These prayers, which were to be recited each morning before communion, included traditional Orthodox formulations by Basil the Great, the father of Orthodox monasticism. It is worth quoting one of these prayers, the Prayer to the Most Holy Mother of God, at length to give a sense of their severe penitential tone. My most holy Lady, Mother of God, by thy holy and all-powerful prayers, banish from me, thy humble wretched servant, despondency, forgetfulness, folly, carelessness, and all impure, evil, and blasphemous thoughts out of my wretched heart and my darkened mind, and quench the flame of my passions, for I am poor and wretched, and deliver me from my many cruel memories and deeds. In a second instance, order communities throughout the country were read a traditional sermon by John Chrysostom, the famed 4th century Patriarch of Constantinople, at their Easter services on April 22nd. Until this time, it had been long-standing practice for priests to deliver spontaneous sermons, using the God self within as their main source of inspiration. With this reading of a sermon, a precedent was set allowing for a gradual increase of formulaic Eastern Orthodox elements and a decrease of charismatic spontaneity in the group's liturgical celebrations. A third traditional practice, the singing of the Trisagion, the Eastern Orthodox version of the Catholic Kyrie eleison, was incorporated into the order's worship services on Pentecost Sunday, June 10th. Rossi also began to introduce Orthodox teachings and iconography into the movement's publications. In the winter 1984 HOOM letter to the Brotherhood, for instance, the Director General quoted extensively from several Russian Orthodox spiritual masters, including Bishop Theophan the Recluse, in his discussion of prelust, or the state of spiritual self-deception.